All right, we have begun to look at Ezra and Nehemiah. We saw that the tradition is strong, the Masoretic tradition, that Ezra and Nehemiah is one work, so that one God-ordained author brought together the material that is in both Ezra and Nehemiah, and we are to study the two as one book. We looked at the themes last time, and now we come to the purpose and the structure of Ezra and Nehemiah. And you can see that I phrased the purpose this way. Although Yahweh sovereignly reestablished the theocracy under godly leadership during the time of Gentile oversight and oppression, that is within the land, because the focus certainly is at this point, all right, now we are into the time of the Gentiles. That as we think in terms of the land, here is Israel's God, Yahweh, and Yahweh now is directing what is taking place in the land. And of course, it is a remnant of Israel that has returned to the land. That God is now showing His will for the land and for the Israelites that are back in the land through Gentiles. Gentiles who issued decrees that come to these godly leaders that God raises up, who become the instruments of bringing to reality what the decree of the Gentiles has been. So that Cyrus issues a decree, and Shalmaneser is a prince, that the prince of Judah, that becomes the human instrument to lead the people back to the land and to establish them there and begin the process of rebuilding the temple. A further decree of Darius in Ezra chapter 5 will reestablish the work of building the temple, and Zerubbabel and Joshua will be the human instruments, and we'll then see a decree issued. Ezra becomes the human instrument. A further decree is issued. Nehemiah becomes the human instrument. And so God is directing. He is stirring up the Gentile authorities that issue decrees that have direct impact upon the Israelites within the land. And then He raises up godly leaders who are instruments to fulfill that. So He has reestablished in this way the theocracy over the land, over Jerusalem, and has provided godly leadership to the returning Israelites during this time of Gentile oversight and oppression. That is certainly seen within Ezra and Nehemiah as well. That as these decrees are issued, they are, well, after Cyrus's decree, they are issued against the backdrop of oppression, of adversity, as far as the remnant back in the land is concerned. So that there is and we've already seen this with Esther, all right? God is certainly sovereignly in control of the events. He is working for the good of His people, but in working for the good of for the Israelites, in response to the Abrahamic covenant, there are those who disdain them. There are those who are not seeking the welfare of Israel, but seeking to destroy Israel. And certainly for a time, God allows the adversaries to be successful. But at the end of the day, their adversity toward Israel, toward the temple, etc., is certainly overcome, and the Lord shows His sovereign protection as far as the people back in the land are concerned. Now, when we get to the structure of Ezra and Nehemiah, there is a fairly universal agreement that the structure follows the returns that take place within the book. And there are 4 of them that are specifically mentioned within the book. And I have given down below the approximate datings. We've already spoken about that. That there is, first of all, and this is an interpretive issue, a return under Sheshbazzar/Zerubbabel. And who is that Sheshbazzar? How we understand him? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we see the events that begin in 538 BC that culminate in 515 BC. And the note, we've already seen this, with which the book begins, is that Cyrus's decree is a decree that fulfills the word of the Lord by Jeremiah. Now, in the English text, we have not yet read Jeremiah, so we have not yet studied Jeremiah. In the Hebrew text, you already know about Jeremiah and Jeremiah's prophecy in chapter 25 and 29 that the captivity would last 70 years. And we will talk about that 70-year period and exactly when it began. And I will give you our conclusion. We'll look at it more detailedly in 502, but that began in 605 BC with the coming of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and their taking of some young men, including Daniel, back to Babylon, and that begins the exile. And technically, from that point in 605 BC, Judah was under the authority of the Babylonians. Their problem is they had a hard time recognizing that for a couple of generations. And so Babylon has to come 2 other times, as you already read in Kings. And the final time, the 3rd time, 586 BC, they completely destroy the temple and the city. But Jeremiah had prophesied that there would be a 70-year captivity, and then the people would return back to the land. Tied in with that was Isaiah's prophecy. Now, Ezra doesn't specifically speak of that, but Isaiah's prophecy, Isaiah 44 and 45, that he would raise up by name a man named Cyrus, who would issue a decree that would allow Israel to return and rebuild the temple. But Ezra said enough here to fulfill the word of Jeremiah, because it's in the 1st year of Cyrus, 538 BC. And if you know Jeremiah's prophecy, you realize, all right, it is time now for Jeremiah's prophecy to be fulfilled. And so the way the Lord starts the process of fulfilling that prophecy is by having Cyrus issue this decree that allows a remnant to return back to the land, which they do. And we believe in 537 BC that they come back, and in the fall of that year, We see in chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, that they set up the altar on its foundations. That they came back to where the temple had been, and they reestablished the altar. Now, realize there's no building around the altar at this point. All they do at the place where the brazen altar was in Solomon's temple, right there at the foundation, they set up the altar, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, and, verse 4, celebrated the Feast of Booths, as it is written, and the fixed number of the burnt offerings daily according to the ordinance as each day required, and then afterwards continual burnt offering for the new moons, etc. That beginning with this Feast of Booths in the fall of 537 BC, right, without the rest of the temple structure, at least from that point on, the altar is functioning. And the offerings are being brought to the altar and being sacrificed there. And verse 6 says, from the first day of the seventh month, so the burnt offerings, the daily burnt offerings began, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord had not been laid. So that now they've got to start to lay the foundation and rebuild the temple. And so in the second year of their coming to the house of God, it is very, very interesting. They bring cedar 3:7 from Lebanon to the sea at Joppa, according to the permission they have from Cyrus, the king of the Persia. All right, so they're doing this under a decree that Cyrus has issued, and they begin to lay the foundation of the temple, which then will come to a halt in 536 BC. Now, it's very, very interesting, the fact that this is to fulfill the word of Jeremiah. Those who survive, let them support with silver and gold, 1:4. So we're getting the idea that just as the Old Testament prophets have predicted, this is like a second Exodus where the people of the land where Israel is give them aid and support to those who will go to the land to establish the Lord's work there. And even the very means and material to build the temple come from the Sidonians and the Tyrians, and they bring cedar wood from Lebanon to the sea at Joppa, and then we'll bring the materials up from Joppa to Jerusalem. Right? Now you're thinking about the narrative in the former prophets. How did Solomon get material, including cedars of Lebanon? With his covenant with Hiram of Tyre, and the Tyrians would send the materials and the workmen, and would come to Joppa and bring from Joppa the material to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And this is one of the problems of having 501 at this point, be before 502, but as you're reading Ezra and Nehemiah in the writings against the backdrop of the Torah and the former prophets and the latter prophets, the author, under the direction of the Holy Spirit, is taking, special, emphasis to say, now, if you're thinking in terms of the Old Testament prophetic word, could this be the second Exodus, which will result in the building of the temple and the establishment of God's kingly reign through the son of David? There are certainly those hints that he puts there, and yet as everything seems to be in place, then the opposition arises. And so from 536 to 520 BC, work on the temple is stopped. And then under the ministry of Haggai, Zechariah, in 520 BC, the people once again start to work upon the temple. This will lead the adversaries to try to stop the work. That's when Darius, who is now the king of the Persians in chapter 6, puts out the search for the decree. They find the decree of Cyrus. And Darius adds to that not only can they rebuild the temple, we already talked about that, but now we will fully support them with tax revenue. So that not only can they build the temple, the Persians are going to give them all the money and all the resources necessary to rebuild the temple. In fact, that's the other interesting thing that takes place in Ezra and Nehemiah, that for a time the adversaries might seem to hinder the work of God, but in the end they don't hinder it, they help it, by their opposition. So we can see how God overwhelms the opposition. And then we see in 615 the temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. That would be 515 BC. And then, verse 19, the exiles observed the Passover on the 14th of the first month, which is still 515 BC, but it is the first month of the religious calendar of Israel. So they completed in February on our calendar, which means March, April, when the Passover comes now for the first time in 515 BC. The Passover is observed within the newly reconstructed temple in Jerusalem. And so at chapter 6, verse 22, the events through 515 BC come to an end. So the decree of Cyrus is in 538 BC. The temple is completed in 515 BC. And it's almost in your Bible, you can kind of put a double line there, because from chapter 6 to chapter 7 is where you jump now ahead to 458 BC. And remember, we said this line right here is where the events of the book of Esther take place, between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Ezra. And once again, we see that Ezra was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, and the king granted him all he requested because the hand of his God was upon him. All right, so he goes to the king, he requests to go back to the land, and of course Artaxerxes is much quicker to do that, but that reminds us again of Torah and the requests of Moses to let Israel go and depart. And of course, ultimately, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh is willing to say, go. All right, well, Artaxerxes doesn't have to have 10 plagues. He responds because the good hand of God was upon Ezra. He responds and gives his decree. And basically that decree from the king is very interesting in 7:25 and 26. And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God, which is in your hand, appoint magistrates and judges that they may judge all the people who are in the province beyond the river, even all those who know the laws of your God, and you may teach anyone who is ignorant of them. Right, Ezra? This is my decree. You go and you establish magistrates and judges. You establish a civil religious authority in the land and make the standard that is followed within the province beyond the river, there in Jerusalem and in the province of Judea. You make the laws of your God. Reestablish Torah as what Israel will live under within the land. And anyone who's ignorant of Torah, you teach them. Oh, and by the way, verse 26, whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king. Right now, remember, you're still Persian subjects. You obey the Torah, you worship Yahweh in that way, and you also obey the law of the king. All right, so you got to obey Torah and the tithes necessary for the temple, the priests, the Levites, the poor within the land, etc. Oh, by the way, you still pay your taxes because the law of the king is still in effect too. And whoever will not observe the law of God, the Torah of your God, and the Torah of the king, let judgment be executed upon him strictly, whether for death or for banishment or for confiscation of goods or for imprisonment. And guess what, Ezra? As you set up these judges, not only will they and the magistrates deal with, the laws of the king of Persia, but these judges, and as you've reestablished following of the Torah within the land, under my authority, what are you to do if anyone doesn't obey the Torah? This is God reestablishing not only the temple, but the Torah over Israel within the land. And so you might have, here is the Gentiles issuing the decree, but really you can almost put an X or a bracket around the Gentiles. God is once again doing what? Directing his people in the land by means of Torah. And the Torah is reestablished, and Ezra was to be the one who was to teach the people if they didn't know the Torah. And of course in chapter 9 and 10, through their intermarriage with the peoples of the lands, we're finding they're not very good Torah keepers at all. And their hearts were being swayed, and Ezra dealt with the issue. And later on, under Nehemiah, he will, in chapter 8, fulfill really what Artaxerxes has told him, which is, you go back and teach people the Torah. But we have the temple. We have the decree that people within the land now are to follow the Torah, along with the laws of the king of Persia. And notice neither Ezra nor the king thought that there was any conflict between the two. They could be loyal to Torah and also loyal to the king of Persia. And there's no indication, Ezra, of any conflict between the two. And certainly having read Daniel, we see the same thing. Daniel was one who was willing both to abide by the laws of the Gentiles, at the same time abide by the laws of God. Now, obviously, in Daniel, we'll see twice. Daniel 1, Daniel 6, well, Daniel 3 too, not Daniel specifically at that point. But where there's a conflict between the laws of God and the laws of first the Babylonians and then the Persians, at that point, all right, the law is disobeyed. But in the end, God overrules, so the Gentile rulers themselves realize, all right, you can worship God and at the same time be obedient to us. And of course, that is the standard which Israel will live under during the time of the Gentiles. By the way, that prepares you for the question to Jesus about whether it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not. And really, in the end, there is no conflict. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Render unto God the things that are God's. In other words, you are still seeking to drive a wedge somehow that to pay taxes to Caesar, to obey Rome, is in some way to disobey God. And at the end of the day, you are to be loyal to both. And of course, that sets the standards for, in the same way, Christians, Romans 13. We are to be obedient to the authorities that God has established over us. And in that way, we show our obedience to God. And 99% of the time, there won't be a conflict between, obeying the authorities that God has established over us and also obeying what God has told us as well. Well, that was for free. Moving on, all right, we've got back to the return under Ezra. And then the first 12 chapters of Nehemiah, we've already talked about, deal with a third return. And once again, we see that even as Nehemiah is praying, he confesses the sins of the people. And in verse 8 of chapter 1, remember the word which you did command your servant Moses. If you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me, keep my commandments, do them, I will gather you from there, bring you to the place where I have caused my name to dwell. These are your servants. And they have responded. And it's very interesting. He brings the provisions of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 to bear upon the post-exilic community. All right, you have scattered and you have gathered. Just as you said to Moses. Now these are your children that you have gathered back to the land, and now they are in dire straits. They are back in the land, but there is no physical protection. The wall is torn down. And so, again, request so that I might go back and rebuild the wall and give to Jerusalem protection, and give to the people encouragements that once again you are at work in providing for them and bringing blessing to them. And so he brings his request before the king, and the king grants his request. And once again, says, not only go build the walls, but on your way, stop by. Here's the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give beams for the gates of the fortress, the wall of the city, for the houses to which you will go. Nehemiah asked for that, not just that he can return, but by the way, could I get all the materials I need, from the keeper of the king's forest to rebuild the walls and the gates and provide the protection for the city? And Artaxerxes says, you got it. I might have to do some deficit spending this year, but you got it. All right, so it was a pork issue again in Persia, and here is the king saying, hey, you're my governor. You got it. Get whatever you need.
Yeah, I was curious if you could comment, since we're talking about Israel returning to the land, when do you believe the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 began?
When do I believe that the 70 weeks of Daniel 9? That's a good interpretive issue that we have in 502. You figured that. I see it as beginning with the decree that was issued to Nehemiah, 444 BC. So that we'll get to, this is the decree that I believe begins the 70 weeks. So we'll look at that in Daniel chapter 9. But it is the decree, it's issued, and Nehemiah goes back. And you got to realize there is more with Nehemiah's return than just the building of the wall. After the wall is completed, Ezra teaches them the law, chapter 8. Chapter 9, there is a great prayer of repentance on the part of the people. They review their history and talk about the fact that they have been disobedient. They have rebelled against Yahweh. Yet Yahweh has in his compassion not forsaken them, because he is a gracious and compassionate God. And so, verse 32 of chapter 9, now therefore our God, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who keeps covenant and loving kindness, do not let all the hardships seem insignificant before you, which has come upon us, our kings, our princes, our priests, our prophets, our fathers, and all your people, from the days of the kings of Assyria to this day. All right, we have had the hardships of Gentile oppression. You're just. But they, verse 35, the leaders in their own kingdom, with great goodness that you've given them, did not serve you. Behold, we're slaves today, slaves in the land. And so you have allowed us, to return. We realize our wickedness. It continues on. So they are seeing that a complete and total end of the captivity has not yet taken place, and yet they repent and reestablish the heads and leaders in Jerusalem, the Levites in the proper place within the temple, so that to the extent possible at that point, they have reconstituted the worship of Yahweh based upon Torah back in Jerusalem. But with an awareness that, all right, we're still in captivity. That the totality of our being brought out from under the control of the Gentiles has not yet been completed. But what we have through the first 12 chapters of Nehemiah, along with Ezra, is the potential and possibility that this could be moving toward the ultimate restoration of Israel as prophesied within the prophets. It's been slow. It's been a slow movement of faith and obedience. And finally, for the people within the land, at least a modicum of obedience to the Torah, repentance on the part of the Torah, and the reestablishment of temple, offering, priesthood, Levites, protection of the city. Could this be the fulfillment, or leading toward the fulfillment, of what the latter prophets had prophesied? Could this be the new Exodus? And in the end, could Nehemiah, along with Ezra, be the new Moses? That is both a political leader and a religious instructor of the people as well. Well, as we come to chapter 13, we see that as they are reestablishing the temple services, 13:1, on that day they read aloud from the book of Moses, in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in that, no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, God turned this curse into a blessing. So it came about that when they heard the law, they excluded all the foreigners from Israel. All right, so at this point, realizing, right, on the basis of what they read in the Torah, in the word of Moses, that they were to exclude foreigners from their midst who did not worship Yahweh. They could not be permitted in. Because prior to this, Eliashib had been appointed over the temple, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room. But during that time, I was not in Jerusalem. And so when I came back, I realized that even though the people knew the Torah, that as I returned, they weren't fulfilling the Torah. In fact, you go through Nehemiah chapter 13. They are allowing foreigners back in. They're not providing for the Levites. They're not keeping the Sabbath. And they had married women from verse 23, Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And now they've had children who can't even speak the language of Judah. And so Nehemiah, in this second return, emphasizes the failure of the people. And we see in chapter 13 there is no repentance, there is no response of the people. And as you go through the chapter, verse 14, again verse 22, verse 31, as Nehemiah is seeking to rectify what is taking place in Jerusalem. All he says is, remember me. Remember me, O God. Remember me, O God. Remember me, O God. Don't remember them. Remember me. And so Ezra and Nehemiah ends up, having read all of this, seeing God's graciousness and how God does bring them back in fulfillment of promises that he had given through the prophets, and how they start to view themselves as at least being a remnant of those ultimately that God will establish back in the land, and the very real possibility this is the beginning of the total fulfillment of the prophets. That at the end, it's the same old Israel. They haven't got a changed heart yet. And so even though, if we might put it this way, God has done everything in grace and compassion toward them, the sons of Israel, the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, still fail to follow Yahweh. They're the same old rebellious bunch they have been throughout the Old Testament. Things have not changed. So that this is not the second Exodus, and not one of the leaders, Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, is the second Moses. And so what Ezra and Nehemiah is communicating to us is that God was gracious. God fulfills his word in bringing them back. But Israel still doesn't have the changed heart. And so the second Moses and the restoration and the fulfillment of the prophetic word in its completeness still lies in the future. And within the Old Testament canon, then you get into Chronicles. All right, and what do the godly who still awaits the second Moses, the son of David. What do they do in the meantime? Well, the history from Israel's past is that they maintain faithfulness to the temple, to the Torah, as they anticipate in the future the son of David, whom Yahweh will send. But we'll get to that in a few moments when we get to Chronicles. So here is the structure. Now, what I've just given you as far as the structure in Ezra, historically, you have a chart in Walton, page 35, that fills in some of the details for you. Now notice he takes the third return and says that's included Nehemiah 1 to 13. We'll realize that after the third return, Nehemiah does go back, as we've seen, to Susa for a while, and then comes back and has a second governorship. And of course, he goes down and talks about the leaders and the Persian king. He gives the elements of the decrees that were issued that really spring then the narrative forward. All right, so the decree is issued by Cyrus. The narrative is showing historically what happened in response to the decree. The decree is issued by Artaxerxes to Ezra. This is the narrative which flows out of that decree. A decree is issued by Artaxerxes to Nehemiah. Here's a narrative that flows from that decree. Those are the men who return, the numbers that return, according to Ezra 2, Nehemiah 7 for the first one, Ezra chapter 8 for the second, and we have no numbers given to us on who returns with Nehemiah. And then we have the events that are accomplished and the problems that arise through these three separate returns, all based upon a decree from the Persian king that is seen in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So that is the structure, that is the historical flow of what is taking place within these books. Again, very selective narrative. All right, here's the events that take place, 538, 515 BC. Stop the video. Take a break. All right? Now here's the events that take place, 458, 457 BC. Stop the video. Stop the tape. Roll ahead. Here's the events that take place, 444, 445, 444 BC. And it is true, it's not so much a stopping of the tape as kind of rolling in to look at all that was accomplished. Nehemiah goes back to Susa. When he returns, look what has happened when he returns. Narrative of the Old Testament historically ends at that point. Nehemiah 13 is the historical end of the narrative of the Old Testament. And what do we learn at the end of the narrative of the Old Testament? Well, that shouldn't surprise you. Things haven't changed. So read the historical narrative all the way through, beginning with, going all the way back. You want to deal with Israel from Exodus chapter 1 all the way through Nehemiah chapter 13. Nothing has yet fully and finally changed. Israel is rebellious. Israel is disobedience. And so obedient Israel with a changed heart, fully restored Israel spiritually and then physically, still is going to take place in the future. And so the Old Testament therefore points beyond itself to, all right, how is God going to accomplish this in the future? And at that point prepares you for the New Testament. Now some bibliographic resources. Ezra and Nehemiah are not well served at this point with outstanding volumes. This is a period of Israel's history which has been, in the past, mightily neglected. And so I've told students for 12 years, if you'd like to break some new scholarly ground in the Old Testament, here's a place to do so in the post-exilic time period, and particularly with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So what's some good bibliographic resources? Well, this is where you have to begin. Fencham's NIC is a stronger work in its conclusions than Williamson's work in the Word Biblical Commentary series. Although if you want to see at this point a good summary of contemporary exegetical debates across the theological spectrum on Ezra and Nehemiah, Williamson's work in Word Biblical Commentary series is a good place to begin. But it is fairly dry, and you got to watch out for some of his conclusions. As I said, Fensham comes to better conclusions than Williamson, but the exegetical data is not as detailed in Fensham as it is in Williamson. So between the two, I'd recommend for preaching purposes you have Fensham. For scholarly purposes, though, if you want to do some research, Williamson is the place to begin. Two, somewhat adequate works. Best of the lot, Kidner and Brenneman, Tyndale series, NAC. If you want a good exposition of Ezra and Nehemiah, there isn't any. There's some works out there on Nehemiah if you want to start preaching the book halfway through. But since you don't, all right, there's no, at this point, exposition of the totality of the book. And for 12 years, students have said, so why don't you provide one? Well, hasn't happened yet, so it's still none. And even I did, I'm not sure what publisher would pick it up, because I don't know what market there is out there even today for expositions of these books. But we don't have anything like a Davis on Ezra and Nehemiah. Maybe if the Lord spares him after he's done with 2 Kings, maybe he'll take the mantle and provide a good expositional commentary on this book as well. And since I am dealing there, of course, I'll just give you I've already said my caveat on preaching Ezra and Nehemiah is do the whole thing. If you're going to do Nehemiah, begin with Ezra. We are committed here to book by book, verse by verse exposition. Well, Ezra and Nehemiah means beginning in Ezra 1 and going through Nehemiah 13. And again, if you want to pick it up at Nehemiah 1, tell people you're picking it up at Nehemiah 1. And give them some perspective of what has taken place in the book of Ezra. But better than the only time that I preached it, I did follow my own advice. We began in Ezra 1 and ended in Nehemiah chapter 13 and preached it as a singular book. So that would be my encouragement to you. And why there's no expositional book is because I don't know of any expositions out there that are on and take seriously Ezra and Nehemiah as one book, as one unit, and exposit it in that way. So, plenty of stuff in the book shack on Nehemiah, you'll see. Everyone preaches Nehemiah, at least the first 8 chapters of Nehemiah. Because we're into management. We're into building things today. I mean, making sure that we mobilize the people of God to get a building built. And so, most of the times it's preached as organizational, management, administrative techniques, leadership techniques from the book of Nehemiah. I don't think that first and foremost the book was written to teach us management techniques in how to build a building. But nevertheless, that is a way in which most expositions, even deal with Nehemiah. Nehemiah has become the 21st century entrepreneur. And of course, it's good to pray, and it's good to have the spiritual dynamics and know your purposes from God, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Nehemiah ends up, building the purpose-driven wall. And I'll let you take that where you want to take it. But certainly, hopefully, as you taking a look at the grander context of Ezra and Nehemiah, you realize it's more than building a wall. You get somewhat of the both historical and theological dynamics of what is taking place and what underlies the book as a whole. So, preach it from that perspective, and that is the perspective of the theological, historical background of Ezra and Nehemiah as a whole. All right, let's just take a few minutes, 20 minutes, dealing with these interpretive issues as far as Ezra, Nehemiah is concerned. The major issue in the discussion of the book in the last 100 years has been number one. That is, what is the chronology of Ezra's return in relationship to Nehemiah's return? Now, you read the biblical text, and for those of us, again, who believe in biblical inerrancy, there is no issue. Ezra 7:7, that Ezra, along with those who accompanied him, went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. All right, under both Judean, Persian reckoning, the 7th year of Artaxerxes' calendar year for us is in 458 BC. And so they goes up in the first month. They came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, in the 7th year of the king, in the summer 458 BC. Well, why is this such a problem? Well, you can see the 3 reasons for those who say, well, this wasn't Artaxerxes the first. Text is right, it's just Artaxerxes the second. And so this is the 7th year of Artaxerxes the second, 398 BC. Well, why do they say this? Well, the first reason that is brought up is Ezra's words in chapter 9, verse 9, as he is praying, when he says that God has extended loving kindness to give us, reviving to raise up the house of our God, to restore its ruins. All right, no problem there. That's what's taking place from 538 to 515 BC. And to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. Now here's Ezra praising the Lord for his loyalty to the remnant in Jerusalem, and includes a wall. And since the house of God is literal, obviously the wall is literal as well. I would point out, give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. There was no wall around Judah, which seems to imply that Ezra was speaking at this point metaphorically. What does a wall stand for? Protection. What he's saying is, you allowed us to come back and build the house and given us protection. No physical wall, literal wall around Judah, Jerusalem. Some evangelicals take this as literal, concerning the wall in Judah, Jerusalem being the one wall, that is the wall in Judah, even the wall that is in Jerusalem, and that with a later implied attack against the Jews. The wall that was in existence when Ezra got there in 458 BC is torn down between 458, 57, and 445, 444 when we get to Nehemiah. I would lean away. I think it's better to just see it here that he's giving a figurative statement. The wall refers to God's protection. We also have the problem of Johanan, the son of Eliashib, in 10:6. All right, so he talks about the high priest, the chamber of Johanan, the son of Eliashib. The problem with that is when you get into Nehemiah, you find that as he speaks about the high priest, 3:1, Eliashib, the high priest, arose with his brothers and priests and built the sheep gate. As you go through Nehemiah, Eliashib is the high priest. And yet Johanan is listed in 10:6 as being the son of Eliashib. But one of the things we need to realize is that names continued on in families. That there is no reason why you can't have Eliashib, Johanan, and have another Eliashib. And the biblical text doesn't put Eliashib Sr., Eliashib Jr., 1, 2, etc. So they're looking for a problem. They're trying to say, all right, chapter 10, verse 6 assumes that Nehemiah and the high priesthood of Eliashib has come to an end, and now we have the son of Eliashib. And the third problem is Ezra seems to deal more lightly with the issue of intermarriage Nehemiah seems to deal with it more lightly than does Ezra. All right, that Nehemiah, pulls out the beard and tells them they shouldn't, have these foreign wives, but there's nothing within the narrative of Nehemiah 13 where Israel followed Nehemiah's directive and literally put away their wives. Whereas when you get to Ezra 10, you see that the people do respond to Ezra's prayer, and then at that point literally do put their wives away. And so the argument is well, Nehemiah was just pointing out the sin. Ezra takes a further step and not only points out the sin, but also leads the men in literally putting away their wives. And in fact, we have the men, beginning with the priests and the Levites, and then the men of Israel listed at the end of Ezra 10. And so it's assumed Ezra 10 is finality. This is where the issue is once and for all dealt with. Whereas in Nehemiah chapter 13, we just have the beginning of the issue being brought to the Israelites. And the other issue, of course, is well, if in 457 BC they did this, why 20 years later would they be sinning the same way? That's on the basis of the Old Testament, that's the easiest question to answer. Why would the first generation repent and put away the wives, and then 20 years approximately later have the next generation have the same problem all over again? Well, you've read the Old Testament. That's not hard to explain, is it, gentlemen? I mean, sin just continues on generation to generation, and because the fathers repented and put away their wives doesn't mean that the next generation wouldn't do the same thing all over again. But these are the reasons that have led the liberals to say, well, Ezra 7 to 10 chronologically has been displaced. It's there for a literary purpose, a theological purpose that, all right, the first thing you do is build the temple, then the next thing you do is reestablish the following of Torah, and the third thing you do is build the wall. But if you take a look at the narrative, Nehemiah chapter 8 is very, very clear that Nehemiah and Ezra had a contemporary ministry. That Ezra was in Jerusalem already when Nehemiah got there. And after Nehemiah accomplishes the decrees for which he is sent, then Ezra teaches the people the law. And had he done so before? Well, if he had, not as extensively with all Israel gathered together and with the response that is seen in Nehemiah 9 through 12. Bright's just basically says 30 got left out in Ezra 7:7. That Ezra went up in the 37th year of King Artaxerxes I, around 428, 427 BC, after Nehemiah. But that still doesn't answer the question, how could Ezra be in Jerusalem when Nehemiah was there after his first return, 444 BC? It's a grasping of straws, and yet you'll be amazed at how much, well, when you read the commentaries, you'll be amazed at how much of the material deals with this issue right here. The chronology of Ezra's return. Was it before or after Nehemiah's return? Now, I know that when you read the two books you read as the one book, did your chapter title, Themes and Purpose, that really popped in your mind saying, Nehemiah must have gone there before Ezra. No, it didn't. Just a straight reading of the text. I think you appreciate the fact that this is the chronological sequence. But it's been a great matter of debate.
Given the point of the Gibeonites, that Joshua makes a treaty, makes a covenant he shouldn't have made. There's a sinful covenant, that God expects them to keep it, and punishes Israel when they don't keep it. Then how can Ezra tell them to divorce their wives who they sinfully married? I mean, it would seem like a corollary. You shouldn't have done it. That's a covenant. In the one instance, God blights Israel because Saul kills the Gibeonites. In the other instance, he says, divorce your wives. How does that inconsistency get reconciled?
Because of the issue involved, and all the commentators will get into this, is the fact that Ezra chapter 10 shows you how extensive the problem was, from priests all the way down to the people. How many families have been affected. So you are dealing with the fact that if this was not resolved, then the implication is these foreign women refused to give up the worship of their idols, the worship of their gods. By the time you get to Nehemiah, the children don't even know Judean. They can't even respond to the Torah. They can't even hear the Torah being read to them anymore. They're within a generation of being destroyed as a distinct and separate people worshiping Yahweh. And the second thing, of course, is that it is through Israel. This is a more subtle attack by Satan than the overt attack that is seen in Esther. That he is seeking to destroy the people of Israel and therefore destroy the seed. And so a greater value, that is the protection of Israel as a people and the purity of a line to bring forth the seed, is of greater importance here than divorce. It's not giving a blanket, okay, you can go ahead and divorce your wives, but in this particular instance, within this particular historical circumstance for Israel, this was a means by which Israel as a people and the line of Messiah was under satanic attack. That is the implication of what is given here. And so the harsh measures of Ezra and then the harsh measures of Nehemiah. But certainly the harsher measure of Ezra, and Ezra 10 is very important to that, because every man that was involved is listed, and you find out how widespread this has become among the remnant generation. All right, quickly, Sheshbazzar. Sheshbazzar is the prince of Judah. That said that Cyrus counts out the articles from the temple of the Lord, Gives the exact number of 111, all the articles of gold and silver, number 5,400. Sheshbazzar brought them all up with the exiles who went up from Babylon to Jerusalem. And then again, when the decree of Cyrus is mentioned in chapter 5, verses 14 to 16, when we talk about the decree, and they are returning, the Jews speak about the decree that then is found in chapter 6. They once again speak about how Cyrus appointed Sheshbazzar to be governor. Now, except for the historical record in chapter 1 and the historical reminder of what God did through Cyrus in chapter 5, everything else in the book of Ezra says Zerubbabel was the governor. He was the one who led the people back. These came to with Zerubbabel. And in 3:2, the altar is built through the influence of Joshua and Zerubbabel, who arise to build the altar of the God of Israel. So that Zerubbabel is certainly in Ezra viewed as being there in 537 BC within the land, going up. He's the first individual listed, and as the governor, and then of course with Joshua in 520 to 515 BC is instrumental in the completion of the temple. So how do you reconcile Sheshbazzar being this prince and Zerubbabel being a prince, a leader? And you can see that, and this has been expounded in the past, these are two names of the same man. You know, we've seen within the Old Testament how men can have the same name, but it probably is not true in this case, because Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are both Aramaic names, not Hebraic names. Zerubbabel means offspring of Babylon. Sheshbazzar means something like sin or Shemesh, moon god, sun god, protect the father. It would seem to be very unusual that one man would have two names, and particularly that one name is reflective of a pagan god, and the other one has Babylon within it. So as you can see, the contemporary viewpoint is these are two separate men. They are not two names for one and the same man. So, who is Sheshbazzar? Sheshbazzar very possibly could have been a non-Jewish appointee of Cyrus as a Persian to oversee the return of the people. He is, as it were, Cyrus's representative. But from the very beginning, restored Israel viewed who as their real leader? Zerubbabel, who by 520 BC is also the recognized governor over the Judeans by the Persians as well. And I would lean very definitely to position B, and so does the Study Bible. But be aware as you read some of the older commentators, they take it almost as just common knowledge that A is the proper understanding. And then what we do when we get to Ezra chapter 4, historically you're reading along, and as the altar has been built, the foundation is being reestablished. The people, 4:4 of the land discouraged the people. Verse 5, hire counselors against them to frustrate their counsel. all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. So from the time of Cyrus, 537-36 BC, to 520, when Darius is going to reissue a decree saying complete the temple. All right, the opposition brings to a halt the building of the temple. But in chapter 4, verse 6, now in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Understand that the letter that is put here is not the letter that was sent to Cyrus in 536 BC. It is a letter sent to Ahasuerus in 465, 464 BC, at the beginning of his reign. And in the days of Ahasuerus, they sent and wrote to Artaxerxes, and here's the text of the letter. And verse 23, as Ahasuerus responds, Artaxerxes responds, as soon as the copy of Artaxerxes' documents, they went in haste to Jerusalem, the Jews, and stopped them by force of arms. So something is taking place in the initial years of Artaxerxes. It is also stopped. Then he picks it up again. The work on the house of God ceased and stopped until the second year of the reign of Artaxerxes. Well, page 36 is the chronological sequence in Walton that helps you appreciate what is taking place here. All right, the work on the temple is stopped, but then in 4:6, you have the false accusation filed, and during the time of Artaxerxes, here is the letter that is sent. In fact, I should have said 4:6, Ahasuerus. That is, a letter is sent during the first year of Xerxes, and then in 4:7, we have the actual letter that is sent during the time of Artaxerxes. Right, what Ezra is showing, and this is among evangelicals, as you can see, the understanding, this is a parenthesis that records continued opposition. Now, why does he put a letter in from the time of Artaxerxes instead of the actual letter that was sent? And the answer is, we don't know. And we probably won't know until we meet whoever the author was in the millennium and say, why did you put that letter in instead of the other one? Well, you might not have had the first letter. So let me show you the kind of vehemence and the kind of official opposition of the people around the Israelites in the land. This is how they argued their case through their counselors with the kings of the Persians, and how they make such a strong case that at times the king of the Persians will back down and issue decrees against Israel. So that even though you're seeing all these decrees which favor Israel, not every last decree, and yet, when the king says, stop the work, what happens? The work is stopped. The decree starts it, the decree stops it. And so the enemies of the Israelites around them are fighting the game of trying to influence the Persian king, because in the end, that's going to affect what takes place in the land. It gets back to what we see as the purpose within the book. So understand that, and this has been brought up by liberals as, see, you can't trust the historical record. Well, if you read it very, very carefully, the text is very, very clear. All right, opposition during the time of Cyrus, opposition during the time of Xerxes, and here specifically, kind of culminating this, the opposition that took place during the time of Artaxerxes. See why it was necessary for God to raise up first Ezra and Nehemiah, who had the ear of Artaxerxes, because of how he was being influenced by letters from the land as well. And that helps you appreciate also what took place during the time of Cyrus, during the place of Darius, during the time of Xerxes as well. Continued opposition from people in the land against the Jews. All that shows us is that not only the building of the temple, but all the historical events recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah show us the sovereign hand of God overcoming the opposition of those that were opposed to Israel and to Israel's God. That just like the rest of the Old Testament narrative, the hero in Ezra and Nehemiah is whom? Who is the sovereign one? Who's the powerful one? Who is the one who's able to overcome human obstacles? Yahweh and Yahweh alone.